Good afternoon, Sunita ji, Chandrabhushan ji, and all friends who've come from various other countries and from within, and friends from within our own country. I'm actually, first I'd like to thank you for organizing this really important initiative. I think it's of tremendous importance, and I'd like to thank you for including me as well. I don't know if I'll thank you yet at the end of the session. Perhaps if nobody's throwing stones at me, I'll thank you at the end of the session. But clearly, I'm not. This is not a gathering, nor is it the way I do anything to start off with cliches. But what Sunita ji has asked me to talk about, you've covered such a huge range of issues that I don't think I could possibly speak about all those issues in the next day or two. I'm going to be talking to you about the road to Durban and climate change. You've all been talking about the windmill energy and the Timbuktu Collective. I don't know what, I'd love to know later. So I just want to start by saying I'm only going to be talking about Durban's very much on our minds at the moment, and what our country and we plan to do, what the road to Durban is, what it means to India, what it means to me, and how the government intends to take it forward. So having got that out of the way, clearly no cliches, because I could use, it is something that I think climate change is something that attracts every cliche in the book. We could, all of us could and do talk about how to reverse climate change, how to unite the planet, how it has no geographical barriers. All of you know those cliches. And it's not that we don't believe, all of us believe in it, that's why they're so often used. But my dilemma, as I stand here before you, is that life is not that simple, and to be very honest, and particularly life in a ministry as complex as the Ministry of Environment and Forests, and in a country of such diversity and scarcity as ours, India. So if my words have to carry credibility to you, to the larger audience, to Durban, and if I have to be honest, if my speech has to be contextualized with the actions and decisions that I take as a public official, as a minister, when I leave this room, I think I need to communicate the complexity of my problems and what our stand is to you, and that's what I'd like to do. So if I first start off by taking the most used cliche of all, which is sustainable development and environment. That itself is a blockbuster expression. It's like three large words: sustainable, development, and environment. Taken together, nobody really has a problem, because the richest person in the most energy-hungry villa or flying his own aircraft, jetting around the world, to a family in a slum will automatically agree in principle that development has to be sustainable and true to environment protection. But then it means different things to different people. And the problem comes when you begin to allocate values, to allocate priority to three very different phenomena. And those are sustainability, development, and environment. And it is at this point that we begin to disagree. As countries in Durban, as individuals in a society, and as stakeholders on this planet. So in a seminar or at an intellectual level, I'm not saying in this room, where you've gone into very great depth, I'm saying at a very general level, it's possible to focus on sustainability as if it were an aspiration or a goal in isolation. But for hundreds of millions in this country, as all of you are very well aware, the key issue is development of livelihood sustainability, as opposed to lifestyle sustainability. And that is what concerns me at the most fundamental level. Because I always say wherever I speak, you can't teach a starving man the value of an Atkins diet. And, somebody who has no lights at home, to millions of our countrymen who lack access to electricity, we can't just say that sustainability entails sacrifice, and until the right technology is found, we have to cut back on power generation and burning fossil fuels. I don't think it's possible to talk to people at that level. And that is the viewpoint, from which I'm standing. And that is one of the dilemmas that faces me. It's not a polemical intervention. It's a very real question. And it's one that any government, any minister, any public official in India has to deal with every day. To believe that this idea cannot and will not influence our perception of where we stand and how we view climate change is futile, because it will influence, and it does influence me. So it's not, sustainable development and environment protection are not zero-sum games. They're not mathematical, they're not statistical gamesmanship, cuts, targets, quotas. All these work in an emergency situation. But in the long term, I think we need to change the paradigm. Sustainable development, and I really feel very deeply about this ever since I've taken charge of this ministry. They are not the duty of just my ministry. They need to be seen, and I'm going to focus all my energies on making sure they're seen as cross-cutting concerns of every ministry, of every department of this government, and of any kind of governance. They need to be embedded and embraced across the board. Because if urbanization is inevitable, our cities need to be smarter, our public transport mechanisms, networks, robust, and so many different levels. And in the final reckoning, environment protection and sustainable development have to be the products of innovation and technology development of a type which we've not seen since the infotech revolution of the 1990s. This could take so many forms: agriculture that minimizes water use, alternative energy sources that you've been talking about, that are not only non-polluting but also scalable. Retooling workplaces and homes so that they're energy efficient without incurring huge costs for users or dramatic lifestyle changes. All these and many more are at various stages of development inside our country. And how do we harness it? This is where the magical answer to sustainable development lies. But we can't look for shortcuts. We can't expect India to look for shortcuts. So I consider the issue of climate change, of the international stand, of what is going to happen in Durban, what we are going to say, to be something that's absolutely critical for environment protection and for future development of the entire planet. It is obviously, climate change is obviously at the centerpiece of global engagements today. Wherever you go, President Obama was speaking about climate change, as Sunita ji just said. So it is at the centerpiece, and it's likely to be also at the centerpiece for a long time to come. But although the international regime for putting climate change in place was done nearly 20 years ago, it's only in the last few years that I think the entire world has woken up to the fact that this is a really serious, fundamental, bottom line, life or death issue and needs to be tackled. And here's where the twist comes in, the twist that really bothers me as a minister and all of us as citizens of the countries that we inhabit. Even as climate change has climbed to the top of the political agenda of nations, it's also acquired deep competitive and economic policy overtones. Increasingly, our partners in the developed world, who are mandated by law to take the lead in mitigation, are measuring their environmental actions in competitive terms. That is, their actions vis-a-vis the action of other countries, developing countries. And the impact of their actions on domestic industry and particular sectors is sought to be protected at the cost of the global goal of stabilizing the climate. So we need to be really careful about this trend, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, because it just doesn't augur well for global cooperation. Once it becomes competitive, once it becomes about protecting your domestic industry, I don't think that they can possibly keep their eye on the global goal of climate stabilization. Governments and civil society representatives who will be meeting at the end of the month in Durban to discuss these issues, to chart out a strategy for ambitious actions to address climate change. And it will be important that they fix as their goal the agenda to protect the climate agenda as outlined in the Bali Action Plan. And we adhere to the Kyoto Protocol commitments. This is what my government believes in, and this is what we are committed to. The prospects of the Durban conference achieving its goals, I think, will be much less possible if it's caught in a vortex of competitive politics. What are developing countries doing? You are actually emitting more. You are major emitters. What is the consumption pattern today? So my appeal really at this point is that Durban shouldn't get caught in competitive politics, and we should keep our eye firmly upon extending the Kyoto Protocol. Developments in climate change negotiations in the past 5 years have strengthened this feeling that we are straying from our assigned path. Successive formulations about MRV in the recent negotiations are indicative of a mindset that's guided by competition, and climate change is being seen not as a project that requires global collaboration, but one that only needs competitive adjustment in the light of what one partner country does vis-a-vis another partner country. At Bali, the concept of MRV was introduced to facilitate measurement of developed country actions for providing support. In Copenhagen, this was converted to arrangements for transparency. I'm just stating what you all know for a reason. The Cancun agreements formalized these agreements through provisions of ICA and IAR. So what I'm really trying to say is that there's a continuous chain of negotiations that seek parallelism between the action of developed and of developing countries, and this is what we need to focus upon. This is what I'm trying to put across. Of late, unilateral measures have appeared on the international scene that clearly constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. I refer, of course, to the recent announcement of EU to impose carbon tax or penalty on international civil aviation emissions under the EU ETS scheme, which is a clear pointer to the extent to which unilateral measures can be used to support the competitive agenda that I've been talking about for sectoral and for trade gains. Our assessment is that the Cancun conference could not settle the second commitment period in Cancun precisely for this reason. Publicly, the developed country parties to KP attribute their inability to accede to the second commitment period because they say they've lost faith in the Kyoto Protocol as a tool for fighting climate change. What's the second? The second argument is that developing countries are emitting much more, and KP countries themselves don't account for more than 26% of global emissions. But this is logic inverted on its head, as all of us are aware. Because KP parties still do represent the largest part of stock of global emissions responsible for climate change, and they're also endowed with the required capability. Two important points. KP reflects a regime to address the climate change that respects the principle of historical responsibilities and respective capabilities. And I think that's a very, very important issue why KP should continue. The effort in the last few years, in sharp contrast, has been aimed at giving the principle of historical emissions a quiet burial and refashioning a regime of actions that are anchored in current rather than cumulative emissions. As you all know, the emissions are going to be blowing around for 150 years. So if international commitments are given a burial on the basis of such one-sided and unilateral interpretations of legal obligations, I think it's unlikely that we will be able to generate or inspire confidence in the international process. My fervent hope is that better sense will prevail in Durban, that we'll be able, and all of you will help us to be able to do this, we'll be able to project the right picture. At Cancun, we agreed to transparency arrangements in a bid to create mutual trust. We really walked the extra mile, even though these were not mandated under the Bali Action Plan. The objective of such arrangements was not to establish comparability of Annex 1 and Annex 1 targets and non-Annex 1 actions. But it was a confidence building measure to increase confidence level in developing country actions. Despite this, there's an insistent attempt to hold the Kyoto Protocol decision a hostage to a decision on new legally binding agreement. I just want to make something very, very, very clear, and I want to state this categorically. A long-term binding agreement cannot be a quid pro quo for a second commitment period. Cannot, should not. A new legally binding agreement is not required for climate change talks to continue because a framework based on the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities already exists in the form of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. And in dealing with any attempt of a nature which talks of a quid pro quo, we are guided by a clear goal. Here I want to emphasize upon the fundamental imperatives that Sunita ji referred to when she was talking earlier of social and economic development and poverty eradication in developing countries, which are not to be compromised under any circumstances and in any arrangement. In Cancun, we had already agreed for a process of review of global goal of climate stabilization in terms of temperature rise. And the review has to be undertaken in 2013 to 15 in the light of the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that's due in 2014. Legal options for the need to be discussed only when the nature of outcomes reached on the 2 tracks of the Bali roadmap are available. I just have a couple more points to make. Therefore, for developing countries like India, Kyoto Protocol is not an issue of competitive actions. It's a substantive issue of discharging historical responsibility. It's also the basis of comparability of targets and actions of all developed countries. It's very important that robust mitigation commitments are adopted by developed country parties on the basis of the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. This is critical. Why? Because legal treaties between countries have to be credible, and also because there must be a science-based and responsibility-based response of the global community to climate change. We in the developing world are by no means lagging behind. We are not spoilers. We are not spoiling the party. We are not refusing to cooperate. We all know, you all know more than I do, of how much action developing countries, how far we've walked, how far we've gone forward to cooperate, how much action developing countries are taking voluntarily to reduce their carbon footprint, to go forward with all kinds of adaptation within our own countries. Some of the recent international studies, for example, a study published by the Stockholm Environment Institute, have concluded that the impact of developing countries' actions and pledges in absolute terms is more than that of developed countries. And that is where we stand. So consequently, at least until 2020, developing countries, including India, will be contributing much more to the entire problem of mitigation than developed countries will be contributing. And that is the extent of our willingness to contribute or to try and solve this entire problem. This is really ironical considering the fact that the convention requires developed countries to actually take the lead in mitigation. And given this scenario, it's absolutely critical that developing countries seek and obtain unqualified adherence of developed country KP parties to the second commitment period. Failure in this regard will endanger the ambition level of parties and will also result in a regime that's inequitable, unfair, and unacceptable to us. In the wake of these emerging tendencies, and also to ensure that the evolving regime remains ambitious and also equitable, India has proposed 3 agenda issues for consideration by the Conference of Parties at Durban. I think it's in the papers that have been provided by CSE. These relate to equity, trade, actions, and IPRs. A framework of one sentence about each. A framework for equity in terms of equitable access to global atmospheric space needs to be established before the burden sharing for climate stabilization is discussed. Protecting our economy against use of border trade measures arising from transparency issues is equally critical, given the propensity of developed countries to use these measures unilaterally. Similarly, technology is key to achieving a low emission growth for a country like India. And in the rush to reach these decisions at Cancun, these issues were not discussed to the fullest extent that we would have liked them to be discussed. And we are now involved in an attempt to make sure that they don't fall off the table. Our effort is to restore these issues on the agenda of the Conference of Parties at Durban. And we've given detailed explanation for these agenda items to be included, and we certainly expect that they will be included on the agenda at Durban. I only want to conclude by saying that as journalists, you really have a crucial voice in acting as the voice of our region. I only say this, please bear with me, not in any patronizing way. I feel that certain sections of the media, I don't want to categorize it geographically, I feel that certain sections of the media write about climate change from a limited perspective of a current consumption pattern. But the use of environmental resources is deeply influenced by historical development pattern, and that is what I believe should be emphasized, focused upon, and projected, so that the people all over the world, people of this country, are aware of the correct perspective and what is actually equitable. You know, as I said before, the difference between livelihood sustainability and lifestyle sustainability is the difference between the ground and the sky. Therefore, I think the press has a very, very important role, and that climate change issues are presented from a more global and comprehensive perspective, anchored in the past as well as the present. And I therefore feel that it's our common responsibility, not running away from mine, but I do feel it's our common responsibility to see that the balance is maintained, in whatever views may be, that balance is maintained in the treatment of these issues. And I therefore seek your support for our government's stand on what we will say at Durban. And I'd like to once again thank Center for Science and Environment for giving me this opportunity to share my views with you. Thank you.